The rope bit into Elizabeth Montgomery's wrists as she was dragged through the muddy streets of Redemption Creek. Her once beautiful blue dress now torn and stained beyond recognition. The year was 1875, and Elizabeth had just discovered that the laws of the frontier offered little protection to a woman betrayed by those she trusted most. "Keep walking, Miss Montgomery," growled the burly man hauling her toward the auction platform erected in the town square. "Your father's debts ain't gonna pay themselves." Elizabeth stumbled, her face streaked with tears and dirt, but her chin remained high. At 22, she'd never imagined her life would come to this, being sold to the highest bidder like cattle. Her father had died 2 weeks prior, leaving behind gambling debts she hadn't known existed. The bank had seized their small homestead, and now Marshal Davis claimed selling her into domestic service was perfectly legal. A crowd had gathered around the wooden platform. Most were men, miners, cowboys, and drifters with hungry eyes. Elizabeth scanned the faces, finding no sympathy, no rescue. She'd lived in Redemption Creek her entire life, yet in her hour of need, not a single soul stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," shouted the auctioneer, yanking Elizabeth onto the platform. "What we have here is a fine specimen of womanhood. Can cook, clean, and comes from good stock. Bidding starts at $50, the crowd murmured as men began calling out prices. Elizabeth closed her eyes, trying to shut out the reality of her situation, when suddenly a commanding voice cut through the clamor. $1,000. The crowd fell silent. Elizabeth's eyes flew open to see a tall man at the back of the gathering. He wore a dark duster, dusty from the trail, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. But she could still make out the hard line of his jaw, the broad shoulders, and the gleaming star pinned to his vest. "Well now," stammered the auctioneer, "seems we have ourselves a serious bidder." $1,000 from Ethan Hayes, the man said, striding forward through the parting crowd. "And you can put your money away, gentlemen. She's already mine." Elizabeth stared at the stranger in confusion. She had never seen this man before in her life, yet there was something vaguely familiar about him. Marshal Davis stepped forward, eyes narrowed. "What's the meaning of this, Hayes? This auction is perfectly legal." "Legal?" Ethan's voice was cold as he reached the platform. "Selling a free woman against her hasn't been legal in this country for 10 years. Not since the war," Davis sputtered. "This ain't about that. She's payment for debts. I have documentation proving otherwise." Ethan pulled a folded paper from inside his vest. "A marriage certificate, signed 3 months ago when I passed through. Elizabeth Montgomery is my wife." Elizabeth's mouth fell open. She had never married anyone, let alone this stranger, but before she could protest, Ethan's eyes met hers with an intensity that silenced her. There was a message there play along. "I've been away working the cattle trails," Ethan continued, his voice carrying for all to hear. "Came back as soon as I heard about her father's passing and these proceedings." He turned to Elizabeth with a gentleness that belied his hard exterior. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner, Elizabeth." The auctioneer, clearly uncomfortable, glanced between Ethan and Marshal Davis. "If she's married, then she's my responsibility," Ethan finished, handing over a stack of bills. "This should cover any legitimate debts. The rest of this charade ends now." Elizabeth felt the ropes around her wrists being cut as Ethan stepped onto the platform. She nearly collapsed, but his strong arm wrapped around her waist, steadying her. "I'll be taking my wife home now," he announced to the disappointed crowd. "And if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me." No one stepped forward to challenge him. Elizabeth felt herself being guided down from the platform, her legs trembling beneath her. Ethan kept his arm firmly around her as they walked through the parting crowd. I don't understand, she whispered once they were out of earshot. I don't know you, we're not married. No, we're not, he agreed quietly. But it was the fastest way to get you out of there. You can trust me, Miss Montgomery. I was a friend of your father's. Elizabeth looked up sharply. My father never mentioned you. A shadow passed over Ethan's face. There's a lot your father never mentioned. Let's get you somewhere safe and then we can talk. He led her to a fine bay horse tethered outside the saloon. With gentle hands he helped her mount, then swung up behind her. Elizabeth stiffened at the unfamiliar intimacy. But given the choice between this stranger and the auction block, she chose to trust him for now. As they rode out of town, she felt dozens of eyes watching them go. Whatever this man's game was, she'd play along until she could figure out a way to escape. But deep down, something told her that Ethan Hayes might be her only hope in a world that had suddenly turned cruel and unfamiliar. The sun was beginning its descent behind the mountains as they rode, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. For nearly an hour they traveled in silence, Elizabeth too exhausted and confused to demand answers immediately. Her thoughts swirled with questions about this stranger who claimed to know her father. We're almost there, Ethan finally said, his voice a low rumble against her back. Elizabeth peered ahead to see a modest cabin nestled in a small clearing surrounded by pines. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, suggesting someone was home. Whose place is this? She asked, finding her voice at last. It belongs to a friend. You'll be safe here while we figure things out. As they approached, the cabin door swung open, and an older woman with silver-streaked hair stepped onto the porch. She wore a simple dress and apron, her weathered face breaking into a smile when she spotted them. About time you showed up, she called. Was beginning to think you wouldn't make it before dark. Ethan dismounted first, then reached up to help Elizabeth down. Her legs nearly buckled after the long ride, and his strong hands steadied her again. This is Martha, Ethan explained. Martha, this is Elizabeth Montgomery. James Montgomery's daughter, Martha nodded, her eyes kind but assessing. Yes, I can see the resemblance. Come inside, child. You look like you've been dragged through hell backwards. The cabin was warm and smelled of fresh bread and coffee. Elizabeth sank gratefully into a chair at the rough-hewn table while Martha bustled about, pouring her a cup of hot coffee and setting out a plate of bread and preserves. Eat something, the older woman urged. Then you can wash up. I've put out some clean clothes for you in the back room. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she reached for the cup. Thank you for your kindness, but I don't understand any of this. Who are you people? How did you know my father? Ethan had removed his hat and duster, revealing thick dark hair and eyes the color of a summer storm. He sat across from her, his expression grave. Your father and I served together in the war, he began. We saved each other's lives more times than I can count. After the fighting ended, we kept in touch through letters. When he settled in Redemption Creek, I visited a few times over the years. But I never met you, Elizabeth said, confusion evident in her voice. No, Ethan agreed. The last time I visited was about 8 years ago. You would have been just a girl then and away at school in Denver. Elizabeth remembered those years at the girls' school. Her father had insisted on a proper education despite their modest means. It had been his pride that his daughter would be a lady of refinement. A month ago, I received a letter from your father, Ethan continued. He was worried. Said he'd gotten himself into some trouble with some powerful men. Asked if I could come to Redemption Creek. What kind of trouble? Elizabeth asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Gambling debts, Ethan confirmed, but not just any gambling. Your father believed the games were rigged, that he was being deliberately fleeced by men working for someone with influence in the territory. Marshal Davis, Elizabeth whispered. Ethan nodded. Davis is just the public face. There's someone else pulling the strings. Your father was gathering evidence, but he hesitated. But he died before he could expose them, Elizabeth finished, tears welling in her eyes. They said it was his heart, but he was never sick a day in his life. Martha placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Eat now, dear. You need your strength. Elizabeth managed a few bites of bread, the food settling uneasily in her stomach. So what happens now? They'll know you lied about us being married. The marriage certificate looked real enough to fool them for a while, Ethan said. And it gives us time to figure out what's really going on in Redemption Creek. Your father's letter mentioned a ledger, a record of all the rigged games and money changing hands. I don't know anything about a ledger, Elizabeth said, shaking her head. He wouldn't have told you, Ethan replied. He was trying to protect you, but if we can find it, we might be able to clear your father's name and expose whoever's behind all this. Elizabeth felt a surge of determination through her exhaustion. Then we'll find it. But first, I need to understand something. Why did you really come for me today? You could have just investigated quietly without involving yourself in that auction. She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice at the last word. Ethan's eyes met hers across the table, something fierce and protective flashing in their depths. Your father once saved my life at great risk to his own. I owed him a debt I could never repay. But more than that, no one deserves to be treated the way they were treating you. Not in any civilized place. Martha cleared her throat. You should rest now, Elizabeth. There's a tub of hot water waiting for you in the back room. Tomorrow will bring its own troubles. Elizabeth nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the day. As she stood to follow Martha, she paused beside Ethan. Thank you, she said softly. Whatever your reasons, you saved me today. His expression softened. Get some rest, Miss Montgomery. We have a long road ahead. Later, after washing away the dirt and humiliation of the day in the privacy of the back room, Elizabeth lay beneath clean quilts on a narrow bed, listening to the murmur of voices from the main room. Ethan and Martha were still talking, their tones serious and low. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. Her mind kept returning to the moment Ethan had appeared at the auction, claiming her as his wife. There had been something in his eyes when he looked at her, something beyond the duty he claimed to owe her father. But Elizabeth knew better than to trust appearances. Today had taught her that the world was far crueler than she had ever imagined. Still, as she finally drifted towards sleep, she couldn't help but feel that in Ethan Hayes she had found not just a rescuer, but perhaps an ally in a fight she hadn't known she was part of until today. Dawn broke with pale fingers of light stretching through the small window of Elizabeth's room. For a moment she lay disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings confusing her sleep-addled mind. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back: her father's funeral, the seizure of their home, the humiliating auction, and finally, the mysterious Ethan Hayes claiming her as his wife. A soft knock at the door roused her fully. "Elizabeth," Martha's voice called, "there's breakfast if you're hungry." "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, pulling herself from the bed. "I'll be right out." The borrowed dress Martha had provided was simple, but clean, a faded blue calico that was a bit loose at the waist but otherwise fit well enough. Elizabeth smoothed her hands over the fabric, grateful for its modest coverage after the way men's eyes had crawled over her torn dress at the auction. In the main room, Martha was setting plates on the table while Ethan stood by the window, a cup of coffee in hand, scanning the landscape outside with watchful eyes. He turned when Elizabeth entered, his expression softening momentarily. "You look better," he said, the gruffness of his voice tempered by genuine concern. "Amazing what clean clothes and a night's sleep can do," Elizabeth replied, though in truth, her sleep had been fitful and plagued by nightmares. "What's the plan for today?" "First, you eat," Martha insisted, gesturing to the table laden with biscuits, eggs, and bacon. "Can't think on an empty stomach." Elizabeth hadn't realized how hungry she was until the aroma of food hit her. She sat down and began eating with more enthusiasm than she'd expected to feel. Ethan joined her at the table, his movements measured and deliberate. "We need to find that ledger your father mentioned. Any idea where he might have hidden it?" Elizabeth thought as she chewed. "My father kept his important papers in a lockbox under a floorboard in his study. But the bank took possession of our house yesterday. Everything inside belongs to them now." "Not quite everything," Ethan corrected. "Personal papers and effects should still be yours by right." "Try telling that to Marshal Davis," Elizabeth muttered. "He had men packing up our belongings before my father was even in the ground." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Davis is overstepping his authority. That's becoming a pattern with him. We can't just walk back into town," Elizabeth pointed out. "They'll know your marriage claim was false." "Not necessarily," Ethan said, leaning forward. "The certificate I showed was convincing. It had the right seals and signatures. They might question it, but they can't disprove it easily." "Where did you get such a document?" Elizabeth asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. A faint smile touched Ethan's lips. "I've made some interesting acquaintances over the years. Let's just say I came prepared for trouble when I received your father's letter." Martha snorted as she joined them at the table. "What Ethan isn't telling you is that he's not just some cowboy who served with your father. He's a federal marshal." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "A marshal like Davis?" "Not like Davis," Ethan said firmly. "I work for the federal government investigating corruption in the territories." "Your father's letter suggested something bigger than just rigged card games in a small town." "So that's why you came," Elizabeth said, understanding dawning. "Not just because of your friendship with my father, but because it's your job." "Both reasons are true," Ethan replied, his gaze steady. "I owed your father, and what he described falls under my jurisdiction. When I arrived in town yesterday and heard about the auction, I knew things had escalated beyond what your father had described in his letter." Elizabeth absorbed this new information. "So what do we do now?" "How do we get back into my father's house to look for the ledger?" "We return to town as husband and wife," Ethan said simply. "You have every right to collect your personal belongings from your father's estate. I'll accompany you as protection. And if Davis challenges us—" "Let him try," Ethan said, a dangerous edge to his voice. "I have federal authority that supersedes his local badge." Martha cleared her throat. "There's something else to consider. If you two are pretending to be married, you need to be convincing. The whole town will be watching you." Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means," Martha said gently, "that you can't act like strangers. You'll need to show some familiarity with each other." Ethan's expression remained impassive, but Elizabeth noticed a slight tension in his shoulders. "Martha's right," he acknowledged. "For your safety, we need to maintain the pretense convincingly." "I'm not much of an actress," Elizabeth admitted. "You don't need to be," Ethan assured her. "Just follow my lead and remember everyone in that town is potentially involved. Trust no one except me and Martha." The gravity of the situation settled over Elizabeth. This wasn't just about clearing her father's name anymore, it was about survival in a town that had turned against her overnight. "When do we leave?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Within the hour," Ethan replied. "The sooner we retrieve that ledger, the better. After that, we can decide our next move." Martha began clearing the dishes. "I'll pack you some food for the journey. And Elizabeth," she added, her kind eyes serious, Remember that while this marriage may be pretend, the danger is very real. Stay close to Ethan." An hour later, Elizabeth found herself once again on horseback with Ethan, but this time she rode her own mount, a gentle mare Martha had provided. The day was warming up, the late spring sun burning away the morning mist as they rode toward Redemption Creek. "How long have you known Martha?" Elizabeth asked, breaking the silence between them. "Since I was a boy," Ethan replied. "She and her husband took me in after my parents died in a fever epidemic. He passed on years ago, but Martha's been a constant in my life. She seems very fond of you." A small smile touched Ethan's lips. "She's the closest thing to family I have left." He glanced over at her. "Your father spoke of you often in his letters. He was immensely proud of you." Elizabeth felt tears prick at her eyes. "He was everything to me. After my mother died when I was 8, it was just the two of us. I still can't believe he's gone." "I'm sorry," Ethan said quietly. "James was a good man, one of the best I've known." "Then why didn't he tell me about his gambling?" Elizabeth couldn't keep the hurt from her voice. "All those nights he said he was at business meetings." "Men have their pride," Ethan said. "And from what he wrote me, it started innocently enough, a friendly game here and there. By the time he realized he was being taken advantage of, he was in too deep. So he tried to expose them instead of just paying his debts." Ethan's expression hardened. "Your father discovered that what was happening in Redemption Creek wasn't isolated. There's a network operating throughout the territory, rigged games, loan sharking, and worse. When good men can't pay, they take their land, their businesses, and sometimes their families." Elizabeth shuddered, remembering the auction block. "Like they tried to take me." "Exactly. Your father was gathering evidence to bring the whole operation down. That's why finding that ledger is so important." As they crested a hill, Redemption Creek came into view in the valley below. It was a modest settlement, a main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising at one end, and scattered homes and farms spreading outward. Once, it had represented safety and community to Elizabeth. Now it looked like a trap waiting to be sprung. "Remember," Ethan said as they approached the town limits, "you're my wife. We've been married for 3 months. We met when I passed through town last fall and corresponded until I returned to marry you before heading to Texas on business." "And you came back when you heard about my father's death," Elizabeth finished, committing the story to memory. "Right. If anyone asks specific questions, let me do most of the talking. Just act comfortable with me." Elizabeth nodded, though she wondered how she was supposed to act comfortable with a man she barely knew. As they rode down the main street, she was acutely aware of the stares and whispers following them. News traveled fast in small towns, and their dramatic exit the day before had surely been the main topic of conversation. They stopped first at the bank, where Ethan helped Elizabeth dismount with a tenderness that seemed genuine. His hand lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, a small but visible display of affection for any watching eyes. "Ready, Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, loud enough for passers-by to hear. Elizabeth summoned a smile, trying to look like a woman in love rather than a woman in fear. "Ready, husband." Inside the bank, the manager, Mr. Whitaker, looked up in surprise as they entered. He was a thin man with spectacles and a perpetually nervous demeanor that had only worsened since Marshal Davis had gained influence in town. "Miss Montgomery, I mean Mrs. Hayes," he stammered. "This is unexpected." "Mr. Whitaker," Elizabeth acknowledged coolly. "I've come to discuss my father's estate and retrieve my personal belongings from our home." Whitaker glanced anxiously at Ethan, clearly intimidated by his imposing presence. "Well, that is to say, the property has been seized for debts." "The property, yes," Ethan interrupted smoothly. But my wife's personal effects and her father's papers remain her legal property. We're not contesting the foreclosure at this time, merely exercising her right to collect what rightfully belongs to her. I'd need to consult with Marshal Davis about this, Whitaker hedged. Ethan's smile didn't reach his eyes. By all means, consult with whomever you wish. But I should mention that as a federal marshal, I'm quite familiar with the law regarding such matters. He pulled back his duster just enough to reveal the badge pinned to his vest. I'd hate to see this simple matter escalate to a federal issue. The blood drained from Whitaker's face. A federal marshal. I wasn't aware few people are, Ethan said mildly. I prefer to keep it that way unless necessary. Now, about those keys to the Montgomery property. Whitaker fumbled in a drawer and produced a ring of keys with shaking hands. Of course. Just to collect personal items, you understand. The property itself remains with the bank for now, Elizabeth finished for him, taking the keys. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Whitaker. As they turned to leave, Whitaker called after them, Mrs. Hayes, I truly am sorry about your father. He was always kind to me. Elizabeth paused, seeing genuine regret in the banker's eyes. Thank you, she said softly, before Ethan guided her outside with a gentle hand at the small of her back. Once they were back on the street, Ethan murmured, Whitaker will inform Davis we're here within minutes. He seemed genuinely sorry about my father, Elizabeth noted. Perhaps, but fear is a powerful motivator. Don't trust anyone's sympathies too quickly. They mounted their horses and rode the short distance to Elizabeth's childhood home, a modest two-story house set back from the main street with a small garden that her father had tended with pride. Seeing it now, with curtains drawn and an emptiness that seemed to radiate from within, brought a fresh wave of grief. Ethan helped her down from her horse, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a moment, their faces were close, and Elizabeth found herself noticing the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, the day's stubble darkening his jaw, the faint scar that cut through his right eyebrow. Ready? He asked quietly. She nodded, unable to find words past the lump in her throat. As they approached the front door, Elizabeth was acutely aware that this might be the last time she entered her childhood home. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet, dust motes dancing in the sunlight that streamed through the windows. Some furniture remained, but many of the smaller items, her mother's porcelain figurines, the silver candlesticks that had been a wedding gift, the landscape paintings her father had collected were gone. They've already taken the valuables, Elizabeth said bitterly. Ethan's expression darkened. Let's check your father's study first. They moved through the house to the small room at the back where James Montgomery had conducted his business affairs. The desk remained, though the drawers hung open and empty. Bookshelves had been cleared of anything valuable, leaving only basic agricultural texts and well-worn novels. The floorboard you mentioned, where exactly? Ethan asked, scanning the room. Elizabeth crossed to a spot near the window. Here, beneath the corner of the rug. She knelt and pulled back the faded oriental carpet, revealing wooden floorboards beneath. This one was loose. He kept his strongbox underneath. Ethan knelt beside her, their shoulders brushing as he examined the floorboard. It looked firmly in place, no different from the others surrounding it. Are you certain it was this one? He asked. Elizabeth frowned. Yes, I'm sure. I saw him access it countless times. She pressed on the board, but it didn't budge. Someone's nailed it down. Ethan pulled a knife from his boot. Stand back. With practiced efficiency, he worked the blade into the seam between the boards and pried upward. The nails groaned as they pulled free, and the board lifted to reveal a shallow space beneath. But instead of the expected strongbox, there was only emptiness. "It's gone," Elizabeth whispered, disappointment crushing her hopes. "They found it." Ethan examined the space more carefully, running his fingers along the edges. "Wait," he said suddenly, pressing against the back wall of the hiding spot. A section of wood moved slightly. "There's a false bottom." With delicate maneuvering, he managed to lift the secondary panel, revealing a much smaller compartment beneath. Inside lay a leather-bound book no bigger than a man's hand. "The ledger," Elizabeth breathed as Ethan carefully extracted it. He flipped it open, revealing pages of meticulously recorded dates, names, and amounts. "Your father was thorough," he murmured, scanning the entries. "This is exactly what we need." The sound of hoofbeats outside made them both freeze. Ethan quickly tucked the ledger inside his vest and replaced the floorboard while Elizabeth straightened the rug. "Someone's here," she whispered. Ethan moved to the window, peering out cautiously. "Davis," he confirmed grimly. "And he's not alone. 4 men with him." Elizabeth's heart raced. "What do we do?" "Act natural," Ethan advised, stepping away from the window. "We're just collecting your things, remember. But stay close to me." The front door banged open without the courtesy of a knock. Heavy boots stomped through the house until Marshal Davis appeared in the doorway of the study, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. He was a broad man with a florid face and small, cunning eyes that seemed perpetually suspicious. "Well, well," he drawled, "if it isn't the happy couple." "Whitaker said you'd be stopping by." "Marshal Davis," Ethan acknowledged calmly. "We're just collecting Mrs. Hayes' personal belongings." Davis's eyes narrowed as they flicked between Ethan and Elizabeth. "Funny thing about that marriage certificate you showed yesterday. I sent a telegram to the county clerk's office. They have no record of issuing it." Elizabeth felt her blood run cold, but Ethan merely smiled. "Not surprising. We were married in Willow Creek, the next county over. Elizabeth had family there who wanted to attend the ceremony." "Is that so?" Davis didn't look convinced. "And you just happened to show up yesterday, right when we were settling her father's debts." "There's nothing happening about it," Ethan replied, his tone hardening. "I returned as soon as I received word of my father-in-law's death." Imagine my surprise to find my wife being illegally auctioned off. Davis's hand tightened on his gun. "Nothing illegal about it. The girl's father owed substantial debts. Debts that I've now paid," Ethan reminded him. "So our business here is concluded, unless you have some other reason for interrupting us while we collect Elizabeth's belongings." The tension in the room was palpable. Elizabeth could see Davis's men hovering in the hallway behind him, hands near their weapons. "What exactly are you looking for in here?" Davis demanded. "This room's already been cleared of valuables." "Letters," Elizabeth improvised quickly. "My father kept his correspondence in his desk. I wanted to save the letters from my mother before they were lost." Davis studied her for a long moment, his gaze uncomfortably invasive. "You know Mrs. Hayes," he said, emphasizing her married name with obvious skepticism. "Your father had quite a mouth on him toward the end, made all sorts of wild accusations. I'd hate to see his daughter follow the same path." The threat was thinly veiled. Elizabeth felt Ethan move imperceptibly closer to her, his body angled protectively. "My wife is simply grieving her father," Ethan said, his voice deceptively pleasant but with steel underneath. "We'll be leaving town once she's collected her things." "No need for concerns. See that you do," Davis replied. "Redemption Creek has had enough of the Montgomery family's troubles." He stepped back, gesturing to his men. "Search the rest of the house. Make sure they're not taking anything that doesn't belong to them." As the men dispersed to other rooms, Davis lingered in the doorway, watching them with undisguised suspicion. "You have until sundown to conclude your business here and leave town. After that, I can't guarantee your safety, or your wife's." With that final threat hanging in the air, he turned and followed his men. Elizabeth released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "We need to hurry," Ethan whispered. "Gather whatever personal items you can't bear to leave behind. We leave as soon as Davis and his men are gone." Elizabeth nodded, her mind racing. There wasn't much she could take, just a few treasured mementos that would fit in a saddlebag. But as she moved to leave the study, Ethan caught her arm. "One more thing," he said softly. Then, aware of the men still in the house who might glance in at any moment, he pulled her into his arms and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle but firm, a clear display for any watching eyes. But what surprised Elizabeth was her own response, the way her heart suddenly raced, not from fear, but from something else entirely. Ethan's arms around her felt not like a performance but like a promise. When he drew back, his eyes held a question she couldn't quite decipher. "For appearances," he murmured, though something in his voice suggested it might not be entirely true. Elizabeth nodded, momentarily speechless. "For appearances," she echoed, wondering why the words felt like a lie on her lips. The journey back to Martha's cabin was tense, both of them constantly checking behind to ensure they weren't being followed. Davis's threat hung over them like a storm cloud, and Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something terrible. "You think he believed us?" she asked as they rode side by side, the town now well behind them. "About the marriage, probably not," Ethan admitted. "But he's smart enough to know he can't move against a federal marshal without consequences. That's why he's trying to drive us out of town instead." "And the ledger? Do you think he suspects we found it?" Ethan patted his vest where the small book was hidden. "If he knew it existed, he would have torn apart the floorboards himself long ago. Your father hid it well." As they approached Martha's cabin, Elizabeth found herself reflecting on the events of the past 2 days, how quickly her life had been upended, how a stranger had become her only ally, and how the simple act of a kiss had left her more confused than she cared to admit. Martha was waiting for them on the porch, relief evident on her face as they rode into view. "Thank the Lord," she said as they dismounted. "I was beginning to worry." "We had a close call with Davis," Ethan explained, helping Elizabeth down from her horse. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, and Elizabeth felt a flush creep up her neck. "But we got what we came for." Inside, Ethan spread the ledger on the table. Martha brought a lamp closer as they all bent over the small book, examining its contents. "Your father was meticulous," Ethan said as he turned the pages. "Names, dates, amounts, and notes about how each game was rigged. Look here," he pointed to a particular entry. "This shows that the dealer was signaling card values to Davis's man at the table." Elizabeth's eyes widened as she read her father's neat handwriting. "There are dozens of names here, not just local men, but people from all over the territory. And here's the most damning evidence," Ethan said, turning to the last few pages. "A list of properties seized after owners couldn't pay their debts, and beside each one the name of the true beneficiary." His finger tapped a name that appeared repeatedly throughout the entries. "Judge Warren Hargrove." "The territorial judge," Martha gasped. "He's behind all this." "According to your father's notes, Hargrove is the mastermind," Ethan confirmed. "Davis is just his enforcer. They've been systematically defrauding people across 3 counties, then seizing their properties when they can't pay." Elizabeth felt sick. "And when my father figured it out, they silenced him," Ethan finished grimly. "The question is how. Your father's death appeared to be from natural causes." "He was poisoned," Martha said suddenly. Both Ethan and Elizabeth turned to her in surprise. She shrugged. "I was a healer before I retired." "The symptoms you described: sudden collapse, blue-tinged lips, No signs of violence sound like poisoning. Probably something in his food or drink. The night before he died, Elizabeth remembered, he had dinner with Judge Hargrove at the hotel restaurant. He said it was to discuss a legal matter. Ethan's expression hardened. They must have realized he was gathering evidence against them. This ledger is enough to send Hargrove, Davis, and everyone involved to prison for a very long time. So what do we do now? Elizabeth asked. We get this to my superiors, Ethan said, carefully closing the ledger. There's a federal courthouse in Denver. Once the right people see this evidence, they'll send agents to arrest everyone involved. Denver is 4 days' ride from here, Martha pointed out. And you can bet Davis has already sent word to Hargrove about your presence. They won't let you leave the territory with that ledger. Ethan's jaw set in determination. Then we'll need to be careful. We'll leave at first light tomorrow, take the mountain trails instead of the main roads. I'm coming with you, Elizabeth said firmly. Ethan shook his head. It's too dangerous. You should stay here with Martha where it's safe. Safe? Elizabeth laughed bitterly. There's no safety for me anywhere until these men are brought to justice. They killed my father. They tried to sell me. And if they realize I know the truth, they'll come for me no matter where I hide. Martha nodded in agreement. She's right, Ethan. Besides, she's supposed to be your wife. A man leaving town without his new bride would raise suspicions. Ethan looked between the two women, clearly outnumbered. Fine, he conceded. But you follow my lead, and if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments. No arguments, Elizabeth agreed, relief flooding through her. The thought of being left behind while Ethan faced danger alone was somehow more frightening than the journey itself. As Martha prepared dinner, Ethan spread a map on the table, planning their route to Denver. Elizabeth watched him work, noticing the confident way his fingers traced paths through the mountains, the thoughtful furrow of his brow as he considered alternatives. How long have you been a marshal? She asked. 5 years, he replied without looking up. After the war, I drifted for a while, then found purpose in upholding the law. Your father actually recommended me for the position. He never told me, Elizabeth said softly. There seems to be a lot he kept from me. Ethan finally looked up, his expression gentle. He was protecting you. Men like us men who have seen war, we want to keep the darkness away from those we love. I'm not a child to be sheltered, Elizabeth protested. I could have helped him. And then you might have shared his fate, Ethan pointed out. He made his choices to keep you safe. Honor that, even if you don't agree with it. Elizabeth fell silent, considering his words. For all her hurt at being kept in the dark, she couldn't deny that her father had always acted out of love for her. What will happen after Denver? She asked finally. When this is all over, something flickered in Ethan's eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps. Justice will be served. Hargrove and his men will face trial for their crimes. Your father's name will be cleared. That's not what I meant, Elizabeth said, holding his gaze. What happens to us, this arrangement between us? Ethan's hands stilled on the map. That depends, he said carefully. On what? On what you want to happen. His voice was low, almost cautious. When we reach Denver, you'll be free to build a new life however you choose. You're an educated woman with refinement and courage. You could go anywhere, do anything. And you, Elizabeth pressed, where will you go? Wherever duty sends me next, he replied. But there was a hesitation in his voice that suggested the answer wasn't as simple as he made it sound. Before Elizabeth could respond, Martha called them to dinner. The conversation shifted to practical matters, what supplies they would need, how early they should depart, which passes might still have snow this late in spring. But throughout the meal, Elizabeth found her eyes drawn repeatedly to Ethan, wondering about the man beneath the marshal's badge. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the sounds of the cabin settling, Elizabeth thought about the kiss they had shared in her father's study. Though initiated for show, there had been something genuine in the way Ethan had held her, something that spoke of more than mere pretense. Tomorrow they would begin a dangerous journey together, one that might lead to justice for her father, but would also inevitably lead to a crossroads for herself and Ethan. Their false marriage had been born of necessity, but Elizabeth couldn't deny that something real was growing in its shadow. Whether that something had a future beyond their arrival in Denver remained to be seen. For now, she would focus on surviving the journey ahead and honoring her father's memory by ensuring his evidence reached the right hands. As for Ethan Hayes and the unexpected feelings he stirred in her heart, that was a mystery that would have to unfold one day at a time. The pre-dawn sky was still dark when Elizabeth felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. She opened her eyes to find Martha standing over her, a small oil lamp casting shadows across her weathered face. "Time to get ready, child," the older woman whispered. "Ethan wants to be on the trail before first light." Elizabeth nodded, shaking off the remnants of sleep. She dressed quickly in the clothes Martha had provided: sturdy riding pants, a cotton shirt, and a fitted jacket that would offer protection against the mountain chill. Practical attire that would have scandalized the ladies of Redemption Creek, but perfect for the journey ahead. In the main room, Ethan was already fully dressed and armed, studying the map one final time by lamplight. He looked up when Elizabeth entered, his eyes taking in her attire with approval. "Good, you're dressed sensibly," he said. "We've got a long first day ahead of us." Martha pressed a bundle into Elizabeth's hands. "Food for the trail, and this." She handed over a small cloth package. "Herbs for pain and fever should either of you need them." "Thank you for everything, Martha," Elizabeth said, embracing the older woman. "I don't know what would have happened to me if not for you and Ethan." Martha patted her cheek affectionately. "You're stronger than you know, girl. Your father raised you well." She turned to Ethan, her expression stern. "And you bring her back safe when this is done, you hear me?" "Yes, madam," Ethan replied with a half-smile. "Though I suspect Elizabeth can take care of herself better than either of us realized." They said their goodbyes quickly, aware that every minute of darkness was precious for their undetected departure. The horses were saddled and waiting, loaded with supplies for the journey. Ethan helped Elizabeth mount, then swung up onto his own horse with practiced ease. "Stay close and stay quiet until we're well away from town," he instructed as they set off. "Davis might have men watching the roads." They rode in silence as the eastern sky gradually lightened from black to deep blue. Instead of taking the main trail that led toward town, Ethan guided them along a barely visible path that skirted the edge of a pine forest, keeping to the shadows. Elizabeth followed his lead, impressed by his woodcraft and attention to detail. As the first rays of sun broke over the horizon, they had already covered several miles, climbing steadily into the foothills that would eventually lead to the higher mountain passes. Ethan finally slowed their pace, allowing the horses to walk side by side on a wider section of trail. "You ride well," he observed. "I was worried you might not be used to long hours in the saddle." "My father taught me to ride almost before I could walk," Elizabeth replied. "He said a woman in the West needed to be as comfortable on horseback as in a parlor." He was right about that. Ethan's expression softened. "He spoke of you often in his letters, how proud he was of your education, your spirit." "You mentioned that before, but you've never told me how you and my father met." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the trail ahead. "It was during the Battle of Chickamauga," he finally said. "I was just 18, terrified and confused in my first real battle. A Confederate shell exploded near our position, killed half my unit instantly. I was wounded, trapped under debris, and the enemy was advancing. Elizabeth listened, captivated by this glimpse into both men's pasts. "Your father was a sergeant then," Ethan continued. "He found me, dug me out, and carried me to safety under heavy fire. Took a bullet in his shoulder doing it. We served together for the rest of the war, watching each other's backs." "That sounds like him," Elizabeth said softly. "He never spoke much about the war, but he always taught me that true courage was doing what's right even when it's dangerous." "He lived by that principle to the end," Ethan said. "Most men would have paid their debts and kept quiet, no matter how unfair. Your father chose to fight for justice instead." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the trail gradually narrowing as it wound through denser forest. By midday, they had climbed high enough to look back over the valley, Redemption Creek now just a distant cluster of buildings below. They stopped in a small clearing to rest the horses and eat some of the food Martha had packed. As Elizabeth unwrapped the bread and dried meat, she noticed Ethan constantly scanning their surroundings, alert to any sign of pursuit. "You think they're following us?" she asked. "Not yet," he replied. "But Davis will discover we've left town soon enough if he hasn't already, and he'll know there's only one reason we'd flee. We found something incriminating." "The ledger," Elizabeth nodded toward his vest, where the small book was securely tucked away. "Exactly. Once he reports to Hargrove, they'll spare no effort to stop us from reaching Denver." "Then we should keep moving," Elizabeth said, quickly repacking the remaining food. Ethan studied her with something like admiration. "You're taking all this remarkably well." "Most women would be hysterical after what you've been through." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Most women haven't had their world destroyed in 2 days. After that, fear seems rather pointless." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Your father was right about your spirit." They continued their journey through the afternoon, the trail growing steeper and more challenging. Ethan set a brisk pace, but not so fast that the horses would tire too quickly. By late afternoon, they had reached a high ridge that offered a commanding view of the surrounding landscape. Ethan reined in his horse, studying the terrain ahead. "We'll camp in that grove of pines," he decided, pointing to a sheltered spot about half a mile ahead. "Good cover, near water and defensible if needed." As they made their way to the campsite, Elizabeth noticed dark clouds gathering over the distant peaks. "Looks like a storm coming," she observed. Ethan nodded grimly. "Mountain weather is unpredictable this time of year. We'll need shelter for the night." The grove proved ideal for their needs, dense enough to provide cover, but with a small clearing at its center perfect for a campsite. A narrow stream gurgled nearby, providing fresh water for them and the horses. While Elizabeth tended to the animals, removing their saddles and rubbing them down, Ethan gathered firewood and began constructing a simple lean-to against the largest pine tree. "That should keep us dry if the rain comes," he said, surveying his handiwork. "I'll keep the fire small, less visible from a distance." As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. Elizabeth shivered despite her jacket, grateful when the small fire sprang to life under Ethan's skilled hands. They ate a simple dinner of Martha's provisions, sitting close to the flames. "How much farther to Denver?" Elizabeth asked, watching the firelight play across Ethan's features. 3 days if the weather holds," he replied. "Longer if this storm slows us down. We'll need to cross Thunder Pass tomorrow. It's the fastest route, but it can be treacherous after rain." Thunder rumbled in the distance, as if emphasizing his point. Elizabeth glanced up at the darkening sky visible through gaps in the pine boughs. "It's definitely coming this way." Ethan moved to sit beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "We should try to get some sleep while we can. I'll take first watch." Wake me for the second, Elizabeth insisted. You need rest too. He looked like he might argue, but then nodded. A few hours of sleep would help. I'll wake you at midnight. As they settled in beneath the lean-to, the first fat raindrops began to fall, hissing as they hit the fire. Elizabeth wrapped herself in the blanket Martha had provided, acutely aware of Ethan sitting just a few feet away, his back against a tree trunk, rifle across his knees. "Ethan," she said softly, "thank you for everything you've done." He turned to look at her, his face half in shadow. "I made a promise to your father to help if he ever needed it. I keep my promises." "Is that the only reason?" Elizabeth found herself asking. Duty to an old friend. The question hung between them as the rain intensified, drumming against the pine boughs overhead. Ethan was silent for so long that Elizabeth thought he might not answer. "No," he finally said, his voice low. "Not the only reason." Before she could ask what he meant, a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the clearing, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The storm had arrived in full force, bringing with it a deluge that transformed the gentle stream into a rushing torrent within minutes. Elizabeth pulled the blanket tighter around herself, trying to ignore the occasional drops that found their way through their makeshift shelter. The wind howled through the trees, and several times she heard the ominous crack of branches breaking. "Move closer," Ethan instructed, shifting to make room for her beside him against the tree trunk. "Body heat will help keep us both warm." Elizabeth hesitated only briefly before sliding over to sit beside him, their shoulders touching. Ethan lifted his arm and wrapped it around her, pulling her against his side. The immediate warmth and security of his embrace made her breath catch. "Better?" he asked, his voice rumbling in his chest against her ear. "Yes," she whispered, allowing herself to relax against him. "Much better." They sat in silence as the storm raged around them, the small fire now completely extinguished by the rain. Elizabeth found herself acutely aware of every point of contact between them, his arm around her shoulders, the solid warmth of his chest, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "You never answered my question," she said finally. "What did you mean? It wasn't only duty to my father." She felt rather than saw him turn his head to look down at her. In the darkness, with only occasional flashes of lightning for illumination, his face was a study in shadows and sharp angles. "When your father wrote to me about the trouble in Redemption Creek," he began slowly, "I was already tracking similar operations in other territories. It was my duty to investigate, yes. But when he mentioned you how worried he was for your safety if anything happened to him, I felt." He paused, searching for words. "I felt personally invested. Your father had shown me your photograph once, years ago, and spoken so often of your intelligence and spirit that I felt I knew you already." Elizabeth's heart quickened at his confession. "And now that you do know me, what do you feel now?" Another flash of lightning illuminated his face, revealing an intensity in his eyes that made her breath catch. "I feel that your father underestimated you," he said softly. "You're even more remarkable than he described." The thunder that followed seemed to echo the pounding of Elizabeth's heart. Without consciously deciding to move, she found herself turning toward him, her hand coming to rest against his chest. "Ethan," she whispered, not entirely sure what she was asking for. He answered by lowering his head, his lips finding hers in the darkness. Unlike the kiss in her father's study, this one held no pretense of performance. It was gentle at first, almost questioning, but deepened as Elizabeth responded, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. When they finally broke apart, both breathing more rapidly, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I shouldn't have done that," he murmured. "You've been through so much." "Don't," Elizabeth interrupted. "Don't diminish what just happened by suggesting I don't know my own mind." His chuckle was warm against her skin. "Your father warned me about your stubbornness." "He was right," she replied, settling back against his chest, his arm still around her. "Now tell me more about these operations you've been tracking. How widespread is this corruption?" If Ethan was surprised by her shift to practicalities, he didn't show it. Instead, he seemed to appreciate her focus on the larger picture. As the storm continued to rage outside their shelter, he explained how he'd been investigating a pattern of land seizures throughout the Western Territories, all following similar methods: rigged gambling, falsified debts, and corrupt local officials. "Your father's ledger is the first concrete evidence linking it all to Judge Hargrove," he concluded. "That's why it's so valuable and why they'll do anything to prevent us from reaching Denver with it." "And after Denver?" Elizabeth asked, returning to the question that had been lingering between them. "What happens when this is over?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "That depends partly on you," he finally said. "What do you want, Elizabeth?" It was a question she hadn't allowed herself to consider fully until now. 2 days ago, her life had been defined by her role as James Montgomery's daughter, her future planned around eventually marrying a suitable man from Redemption Creek and settling into a comfortable life of domesticity. Now, everything had changed. "I want justice for my father," she said firmly. "And after that, I want a life with purpose. I don't think I could go back to just being someone's wife after everything I've seen." "You could never be just anything," Ethan said with quiet certainty. "And there's no reason you couldn't have both purpose and," he hesitated, "and love." Elizabeth finished for him. "Yes," he agreed softly. "And love." The storm was beginning to abate, the thunder now a distant rumble. Elizabeth felt herself growing drowsy, lulled by the rhythmic sound of rain and the steady beat of Ethan's heart beneath her ear. "Get some sleep," he murmured, his hand gently stroking her hair. "I'll wake you for your watch." Elizabeth wanted to protest that she was still perfectly alert, but her heavy eyelids betrayed her. The last thing she remembered before drifting off was the feeling of Ethan's lips pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. She woke to gray dawn light filtering through the trees, and the realization that Ethan had never woken her for her watch. He was still sitting against the tree trunk, his arm around her, but his eyes were alert, scanning their surroundings. "You let me sleep through the night," she accused, sitting up and stretching her stiff muscles. "You needed the rest more than I did," he replied unapologetically. "Besides, I'm used to long nights on the trail." The rain had stopped, but everything was wet and dripping. Their fire was long extinguished, and the air held a damp chill that penetrated to the bone. Elizabeth stood, wincing at her cramped limbs, and moved to check on the horses while Ethan gathered their few belongings. "The stream's running high," she reported when she returned. "Will that be a problem for crossing Thunder Pass?" Ethan nodded grimly. "It could make things tricky." The trail follows a narrow ridge in places, with steep drop-offs on both sides. After heavy rain, parts of it can wash out. "Is there another route?" "Only by going back down to the valley and taking the main road, which would add 2 days to our journey and expose us to anyone searching for us." Elizabeth squared her shoulders. "Then we take Thunder Pass. I'm not afraid." Something like pride flickered in Ethan's eyes. "I never thought you were." He handed her a piece of jerky and a biscuit from their provisions. "Eat quickly. We should move while we have daylight." They broke camp efficiently and were on the trail within half an hour, the horses picking their way carefully over the rain-slicked ground. As they climbed higher, the forest thinned, giving way to rocky outcroppings and occasional meadows brilliant with wildflowers. By mid-morning, they had reached the approach to Thunder Pass, a narrow saddle between two towering peaks. The trail ahead wound precariously along the mountainside, in places barely wide enough for a single horse. "Stay close behind me," Ethan instructed. "If your horse balks at anything, give her her head. She knows what's safe better than you do." Elizabeth nodded, grateful for the gentle mare Martha had provided. The animal seemed sure-footed and calm, even as the trail grew more treacherous. They proceeded slowly, the silence broken only by the sound of hooves on stone and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Elizabeth tried not to look at the dizzying drop to her right, focusing instead on Ethan's broad back ahead of her. They were about halfway across the pass when disaster struck. A section of trail that had been undermined by the rain suddenly gave way beneath Ethan's horse. The animal neighed in terror as its hind legs scrambled for purchase on the crumbling edge. "Ethan!" Elizabeth cried out, reining her horse to a halt. With remarkable presence of mind, Ethan kicked free of the stirrups and threw himself forward off the horse as it began to slide backwards. He landed hard on the solid part of the trail, rolling to absorb the impact. His horse wasn't so fortunate with a final desperate whinny. It lost its battle with gravity and disappeared over the edge. Elizabeth's heart nearly stopped as she dismounted and rushed forward to where Ethan lay, fearing he might be seriously injured. "Are you hurt?" she asked frantically, kneeling beside him. He groaned, pushing himself to a sitting position. "Nothing broken, I think, just bruised." His face was grim as he looked back at the place where his horse had gone over. "Poor beast didn't stand a chance." "I'm just grateful you're alive," Elizabeth said, helping him to his feet. She could feel him wince as he put weight on his right ankle. "You're injured." "It's just a sprain," he insisted, though his face had gone pale with pain. "We need to keep moving. We can both ride your horse." Elizabeth looked dubiously at the narrow trail ahead, now with a gaping hole where part of it had collapsed. "Can we get past that?" Ethan studied the gap. "It's risky but possible. Your mare is lighter than my gelding was. If we lead her carefully and distribute our weight right, she should make it across." They approached the damaged section cautiously. Ethan tested each step before putting his full weight down, using a fallen branch as a makeshift walking stick. The gap was about 6 feet across with a treacherous slope of loose rocks and dirt where the trail had been. "I'll go first," Ethan decided. "If it holds me, it should hold you and the horse." "Your ankle," Elizabeth protested, "is manageable," he finished firmly. "Stay here until I call for you." Elizabeth watched anxiously as Ethan made his way across the gap, testing each foothold carefully before proceeding. Despite his injury, he moved with confidence born of experience. When he reached the solid trail on the other side, he turned back to her. "Now bring the horse," he called. "Keep to the upper edge where the ground seems firmest." Elizabeth took a deep breath and began leading her mare across the damaged section. The horse snorted nervously but followed her lead, stepping carefully where directed. Halfway across, a section of dirt gave way under the mare's front hoof, causing the animal to shy sideways toward the drop-off. "Easy, girl," Elizabeth soothed, her heart in her throat as she pulled gently but firmly on the reins, guiding the horse back to safer ground. "Just a few more steps." With relief, she finally reached Ethan on the other side. He immediately pulled her into a tight embrace, his relief evident in the strength of his arms around her. "Well done," he murmured into her hair. "I knew you could do it." For a moment, they simply held each other, the shared danger bringing a new intimacy between them. Then Ethan reluctantly pulled away, his practical nature reasserting itself. "We need to keep moving," he said. "We've lost time, and with only one horse we'll be slower. Can you ride while I walk?" Elizabeth shook her head. "Not with your ankle injured. We'll both walk and lead the horse. We can alternate riding if necessary." Ethan looked like he might argue but then nodded in agreement. The pass widens soon. It will be easier going after that. They continued their journey, making slower progress than before but steadily moving forward. By late afternoon, they had descended from the highest part of the pass into a sheltered valley on the other side. A small, crystal-clear lake reflected the surrounding peaks, its shores lined with aspen trees just beginning to leaf out. "We'll camp here tonight," Ethan decided, looking at the darkening sky. "It's protected from the wind, and there's good grazing for the horse." As they set up camp, Elizabeth noticed Ethan favoring his injured ankle more and more. When they finally sat down to eat their meager dinner, she insisted on examining it. "Let me see," she said firmly, kneeling in front of him. "Martha gave me herbs for pain and swelling." Reluctantly, Ethan extended his leg, allowing her to carefully remove his boot. His ankle was swollen and beginning to bruise, but when she gently probed the area, she found no signs of a break. "You're right, it's just a sprain," she confirmed, "but a bad one. You need to stay off it as much as possible." She soaked a cloth in the cold lake water and wrapped it around his ankle, then prepared a poultice from Martha's herbs. As she worked, she was acutely aware of Ethan watching her, his gaze thoughtful. "You would have made a good doctor," he observed. Elizabeth smiled. "My mother taught me basic healing before she died. She believed every woman should know how to care for the sick and injured." "She was a wise woman," Ethan said, "like her daughter." The simple compliment warmed Elizabeth more than she expected. "Hold still," she instructed, binding the poultice in place with strips torn from a spare shirt. "That should help with the swelling." "Thank you," Ethan said, his hand catching hers as she finished, "for everything." Their eyes met, and Elizabeth felt that same pull she'd experienced during the storm the night before. Without the immediate danger of pursuit or the drama of the trail collapse, the attraction between them seemed more real somehow, more significant. "I was so afraid when I saw your horse go over the edge," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "For a moment I thought I'd lost you too." Ethan's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "It would take more than a mountain trail to separate me from you now, Elizabeth Montgomery." "Is that a promise, Marshal Hayes?" she asked, a small smile playing at her lips despite the seriousness in her eyes. "The most solemn one I've ever made," he replied, drawing her toward him until she was sitting beside him, their shoulders touching. "When this is all over, when Hargrove and his men are facing justice, I want to see where this leads. You and me." Elizabeth felt a flutter of hope in her chest. "Even though our marriage is just a pretense." "Especially because of that," Ethan said. "We have the chance to choose each other, not out of necessity or convention, but because of what we've discovered in each other during this journey." The sincerity in his voice moved her deeply. In the space of just 3 days, this man had become more important to her than anyone else in the world. It wasn't just gratitude for his protection, or the intense circumstances throwing them together. It was something fundamental in who he was, in how he saw her as an equal partner rather than someone to be sheltered. "I would like that very much," she said softly. Ethan's smile was more brilliant than she had yet seen, transforming his normally serious face into something truly handsome. He leaned forward, his hand coming up to cup her cheek as he kissed her, not with the desperate intensity of the night before, but with tender promise, as if sealing a pact between them. When they parted, Elizabeth rested her head on his shoulder, gazing out at the peaceful lake now gilded with the last rays of sunset. "How much farther to Denver?" she asked. 2 more days, Ethan replied. "The worst of the mountain crossing is behind us now. From here, it's mostly downhill to the high plains, then into the city." "And then justice for my father," Elizabeth said with quiet determination. "Justice," Ethan agreed, and perhaps a new beginning for us. As darkness fell around them, they prepared for another night on the trail. Despite the dangers still ahead and the grief still fresh in her heart, Elizabeth found herself filled with an unexpected sense of hope. Whatever the future held, she would face it with this man beside her, a man who had saved her not just from an auction block, but from a life without purpose or true partnership. As she drifted towards sleep, Ethan's arm securely around her, Elizabeth realized that in the midst of losing everything she had known, she might have found something even more precious, a love born of shared danger and mutual respect, a foundation on which to build whatever came next. The following morning dawned clear and cool, the mountain air crisp with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Elizabeth woke to find Ethan already up, testing his weight on his injured ankle. Though still swollen, it seemed to be bearing his weight better than the day before. "The herbs helped," he acknowledged when he saw her watching. "I'll be able to walk today, though we'll need to take it slower than I'd like." They ate a quick breakfast and broke camp efficiently, both aware that every hour brought the possibility of pursuit closer. With only one horse between them, they decided that Elizabeth would ride while Ethan walked, at least until his ankle tired. The trail from the lake descended gradually through pine forests and occasional meadows brilliant with spring wildflowers. By midday, they had reached lower elevations where the trees were larger and the landscape less rugged. They stopped briefly by a clear stream to rest and water the horse. "We're making good time despite everything," Ethan observed, studying the position of the sun. "We should reach the foothills by nightfall." Elizabeth dismounted, stretching her legs. "Let me walk for a while. You should rest your ankle." Ethan looked like he might refuse, but the practical wisdom of her suggestion won out. He nodded and carefully mounted the mare, adjusting himself in the saddle that was smaller than he was accustomed to. As they continued their journey, Elizabeth walking alongside the horse with Ethan riding, she found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed in just a few days. A week ago, she had been the respectable daughter of a well-regarded citizen, her future predictable and secure. Now she was a woman on the run, pursued by corrupt officials, her only ally a federal marshal with whom she was falling increasingly in love. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "How quickly life can change," she replied honestly, "and how sometimes what seems like the worst thing that could happen leads to unexpected possibilities." Ethan's eyes softened as he looked down at her. "Your father would be proud of how you've handled all this." "I hope so," Elizabeth said, a wave of grief washing over her. "I miss him so much. There's still a part of me that can't believe he's really gone." "I understand," Ethan said gently. "After the war, I lost my parents to the fever epidemic that swept through our town. Even though I was a grown man who'd seen battle, nothing prepared me for that loss." "How did you cope?" Elizabeth asked, grateful for his willingness to share his own pain. "One day at a time," he answered simply. "And by finding purpose in my work. Your father helped me with that, convinced me that upholding the law was a way to bring order to a chaotic world." They continued in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of their journey creating a peaceful interlude despite the urgency of their mission. By late afternoon, the landscape had changed noticeably, the mountains receding behind them as they entered the rolling foothills that would eventually give way to the high plains surrounding Denver. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Ethan spotted a small abandoned homestead in a sheltered hollow, a simple cabin with a partially collapsed roof, but enough structure remaining to provide shelter for the night. "We'll stop here," he decided. "It's defensible, out of sight from the main trail, and will give us better protection than sleeping in the open." They approached cautiously, Ethan's hand resting on his revolver as he scanned for any signs of recent occupation. The cabin had clearly been abandoned for years, the door hanging from one hinge, windows empty of glass. The small garden plot overgrown with native grasses. "Looks like whoever lived here left in a hurry," Elizabeth observed, noting the few pieces of broken furniture still inside. "Probably during the early mining boom," Ethan suggested. "When the gold didn't pan out, many settlers abandoned their claims to try their luck elsewhere. They set about making the cabin habitable for the night." Elizabeth swept away years of dust and debris while Ethan gathered firewood and tended to the horse, securing it in what remained of a small lean-to attached to the cabin. As darkness fell, they sat before a small fire in the cabin's stone hearth, sharing the last of Martha's provisions. The ledger that had been their reason for fleeing lay on the rough-hewn table between them, a reminder of all that was at stake. "We should reach Denver by tomorrow evening," Ethan said, studying the small book thoughtfully. "Once this evidence is in the right hands, things will move quickly. Federal agents will be dispatched to arrest Hargrove, Davis, and anyone else implicated. And my father's name will be cleared," Elizabeth added, her voice firm with conviction. "Yes," Ethan agreed. "Your father's reputation will be restored, and his courage in exposing this corruption will be recognized." "What about his property, our home?" Elizabeth asked. "Can it be recovered?" Ethan's expression turned apologetic. "That's more complicated. Legal proceedings to restore property can take months or even years. But with the evidence we have, there's a good chance you'll eventually receive compensation, if not the property itself." Elizabeth nodded, accepting this reality. "I'm not sure I would want to return to Redemption Creek anyway. Not after everything that's happened." "Where would you go?" Ethan asked, his eyes studying her face in the flickering firelight. "I'm not certain," she admitted. "Perhaps Denver, at least to start. It's a growing city with opportunities for educated women." "You could teach," Ethan suggested. "With your schooling in Denver, you'd be qualified." Elizabeth considered this. "Perhaps, or I might find other work. The world is changing, women are finding new roles beyond the traditional ones of wife and mother." "And what about those traditional roles?" Ethan asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Do they have no place in your future plans?" Elizabeth looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "They do," she said softly, "but only if they come with partnership and respect. I could never be content with a marriage like many I've seen, where the wife is little more than a possession or an ornament." "No," Ethan agreed, a smile touching his lips. "I can't imagine you ever being content with such an arrangement." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional soft nickering of the horse outside. Elizabeth found herself studying Ethan's face, memorizing the strong line of his jaw, the way the firelight caught in his eyes, the tiny scar that cut through his right eyebrow. "What about you?" she finally asked. "What will you do after Denver?" Ethan considered the question. "There's always more work for a federal marshal. Corruption isn't limited to Judge Hargrove's operation. There are similar situations throughout the territories." "So you'll move on to the next case," Elizabeth said, unable to keep a note of disappointment from her voice. Ethan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Not necessarily," he said. "I've been thinking about requesting a permanent posting in Denver. The federal courthouse there needs experienced marshals, and it would mean less traveling, more stability." "And why would you want that?" Elizabeth asked, her heart beating faster at the implication. "Because I've discovered something more important than the next case," he said simply. "Someone worth building a life around if she'll have me." The directness of his words took Elizabeth's breath away. "Ethan, are you not proposing?" he clarified quickly. Not yet. That would be too soon for both of us. But I am declaring my intentions, Elizabeth. These past few days have shown me what kind of woman you are: brave, intelligent, compassionate. When this is over, I want to court you properly, if you're willing. Elizabeth felt a smile spreading across her face. I believe I would be very willing, Marshal Hayes. The tension visibly left Ethan's shoulders at her response. He stood, moving around the table to kneel beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. I know this isn't the conventional way these things are done, he said, but nothing about our meeting has been conventional. I think we're beyond conventions now, Elizabeth replied, her voice soft with emotion. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Ethan reached up to cup her face gently, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. May I kiss you, Miss Montgomery? With no pretenses this time, no audience watching, just us and what we feel for each other. Yes, she whispered, already leaning toward him. Their lips met in a kiss that held all the promise of new beginnings. Elizabeth's hands came up to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her fingers. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. Whatever happens tomorrow, he murmured, know that meeting you has changed everything for me. And for me, Elizabeth replied, realizing the truth of her words even as she spoke them. In the midst of loss and danger, she had found something precious not just in Ethan but in herself. A strength she hadn't known she possessed, a clarity about what truly mattered in life. They slept that night side by side on blankets spread before the hearth, Ethan's arm protectively around Elizabeth's waist, her head resting on his shoulder. Despite the hard floor and the uncertainty that still lay ahead, Elizabeth slept more peacefully than she had since her father's death, comforted by the solid presence of the man beside her and the hope that had bloomed between them. Morning came with golden light streaming through the broken windows of the cabin. Elizabeth woke to find Ethan already up and moving about, his injured ankle clearly improved with rest. He had rekindled the fire and was brewing coffee in a small pot he'd found among the cabin's abandoned items. I think it's safe, he said when he noticed her watching. The pot was still in decent condition. Elizabeth sat up, smoothing her hair back from her face. It smells wonderful. I didn't realize how much I've missed coffee these past few days. Ethan poured the steaming liquid into 2 chipped cups and handed one to her. It's not fancy, but it's hot. They sat together in comfortable silence, sipping the bitter brew and watching the sun climb higher in the eastern sky. After the intensity of their conversation the night before, there was a new ease between them, a sense of shared purpose that went beyond their immediate mission. We should reach the outskirts of Denver by late afternoon, Ethan said as they prepared to leave. The federal courthouse will likely be closed by then, but I know where to find Judge Wilson, the senior federal judge for the territory. He's a good man, incorruptible. We can bring the ledger directly to him. Elizabeth nodded, gathering their few belongings. And then what? Then you'll need a safe place to stay while the arrests are made. I have a friend who runs a respectable boarding house near the courthouse, Mrs. Callahan. She takes in mostly law clerks and government workers, but she'll have room for you. And you, Elizabeth asked, where will you stay? I have quarters at the federal building, Ethan replied. Once the evidence is secure, I'll likely be part of the team sent to arrest Hargrove and his associates. Elizabeth felt a chill at the thought of Ethan riding back into danger. Will that be dangerous? It could be, he admitted. Men like Hargrove don't surrender easily, but we'll have the element of surprise and a fully armed federal contingent. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern horizon, following a trail that gradually widened into a proper road as they descended further from the mountains. They alternated riding and walking, making steady progress across the high plains that surrounded Denver. By mid-afternoon, they could see the city in the distance, a growing settlement sprawled along the South Platte River, with the Rocky Mountains forming a dramatic backdrop to the west. Smoke rose from factories and homes, and the glint of sunlight on metal tracks revealed the railroad that had brought unprecedented growth to the frontier town. "It's bigger than I remembered," Elizabeth observed. She had visited Denver during her schooling years, but hadn't returned in nearly 5 years. "It grows every day," Ethan replied. "The railroad has changed everything. What was once a mining camp is becoming a proper city." As they approached the outskirts, the road grew busier with wagons, riders, and pedestrians. Elizabeth became acutely aware of their travel-worn appearance, her borrowed men's clothing, Ethan's unshaven face, both of them dusty from the trail. They would attract attention in the more civilized surroundings of the city. "We should find somewhere to clean up before we approach the courthouse," she suggested. "We look like we've been running from the law rather than upholding it." Ethan glanced down at himself and chuckled. "You're right. There's a livery stable at the edge of town run by an old Army friend of mine. We can stop there first, get cleaned up, and borrow more suitable attire." The livery stable was a large wooden structure with adjacent corrals and a small house. As they approached, a burly man with a thick beard emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His weathered face broke into a wide grin when he recognized Ethan. "Hayes, you old devil," he called, striding forward to clasp Ethan's hand. "Didn't expect to see you riding and looking like you've been wrestling mountain lions." "Hello, Sam," Ethan replied warmly. "It's been a while. We could use some help and discretion." Sam's eyes moved to Elizabeth, curiosity evident in his expression. "Madam," he greeted her with a respectful nod. "Any friend of Hayes is welcome here." "This is Miss Elizabeth Montgomery," Ethan introduced her, reverting to her unmarried name now that they were among friends. "We've had a difficult journey from Redemption Creek." Sam's expression turned serious. "Come inside, both of you. The missus will get you sorted out." Sam's wife, Clara, was a motherly woman who immediately took charge, ushering Elizabeth into a back bedroom with promises of hot water and clean clothes. True to her word, within the hour Elizabeth found herself bathed, her hair properly arranged, and dressed in a simple but respectable blue dress borrowed from Clara's daughter. When she emerged into the main room, she found Ethan similarly transformed, freshly shaved, his hair trimmed, wearing clean clothes that Sam had provided. He turned when she entered, and the appreciation in his eyes made her cheeks warm. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "And you look quite handsome, Marshal Hayes," she replied with a small smile. Sam cleared his throat, bringing them back to the matter at hand. "I've had the stable boy take your horse around back," he informed them, "and I've got the buggy hitched up for you to use. Less conspicuous than riding double into town." "Thank you, Sam," Ethan said gratefully. "We need to get to Judge Wilson's house as quickly as possible. It's a matter of federal importance." Sam nodded, asking no questions. "The buggy's ready whenever you are." Before they left, Ethan pulled Sam aside for a private conversation. Elizabeth couldn't hear what was said, but from Sam's solemn nod and the way his hand moved briefly to the revolver at his hip, she guessed that Ethan was warning him of possible danger. They said their goodbyes to Sam and Clara, promising to return the borrowed items as soon as possible, and set off in the buggy toward the more affluent neighborhood where Judge Wilson resided. As they drove through the bustling streets of Denver, Elizabeth was struck by how normal everything seemed, people going about their business, shops open, children playing a sharp contrast to the danger and drama they had lived through over the past few days. "It feels strange," she commented, "to be among all these people who have no idea what we've been through." Ethan glanced at her, understanding in his eyes. "That's often how it is. The most important battles are fought quietly, away from public view." They arrived at Judge Wilson's residence, as the sun was setting an impressive 2-story brick home with gaslight illuminating the windows. Ethan helped Elizabeth down from the buggy, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Elizabeth nodded, squaring her shoulders. "For my father," she said. "For your father," Ethan agreed, "and for justice." They approached the front door together, Ethan's hand resting protectively at the small of Elizabeth's back. Whatever happened next, they would face it as they had faced everything since that moment on the auction platform together, united by a bond forged in danger and strengthened by growing love. Judge Wilson himself answered the door, a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. Recognition flashed across his face when he saw Ethan. "Marshal Hayes," he said with evident surprise, "this is unexpected." "I apologize for the intrusion, Your Honor," Ethan replied formally, "but we have urgent business that couldn't wait until morning. May we come in?" The judge studied them both for a moment, then nodded, stepping back to allow them entry. Of course. Inside, they were shown to a well-appointed study lined with law books and illuminated by a combination of gaslight and a crackling fire in the hearth. Judge Wilson gestured for them to sit in leather chairs before his desk. "Now, what's this urgent business?" he asked, his tone businesslike but not unfriendly. "Your Honor, this is Miss Elizabeth Montgomery," Ethan began. Her father, James Montgomery, was a resident of Redemption Creek until his death 2 weeks ago, a death we have reason to believe was not from natural causes. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. "Go on." For the next half hour, they took turns explaining everything that had happened: James Montgomery's discovery of corruption, the rigged gambling operations, his suspicious death, Elizabeth's near auction, and their dangerous journey to Denver with the evidence. Throughout the account, Judge Wilson listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grave. Finally, Ethan produced the ledger from inside his vest and placed it on the desk. "This contains detailed records of every rigged game, every property seized, and most importantly, proof that Judge Warren Hargrove is behind the entire operation." Judge Wilson's face hardened at the mention of his fellow judge. "Hargrove," he muttered, shaking his head. "I've had suspicions about him for years, but never enough evidence to act upon." He opened the ledger, scanning its pages with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to evaluating evidence. After several minutes of silent reading, he looked up, his expression resolute. "This is indeed damning," he confirmed, "more than enough to justify immediate action." He turned to Elizabeth, his manner softening slightly. "Miss Montgomery, your father was a brave man. What he did in gathering this evidence, knowing the risks, shows extraordinary courage." "Thank you, Your Honor," Elizabeth replied, tears pricking at her eyes. "All I want is for his name to be cleared and for those responsible to face justice." "And they will," Judge Wilson assured her. He turned back to Ethan. "I'll summon Marshal Jenkins and his deputies immediately. We'll need to organize arrests warrants and a plan to take Hargrove and his associates into custody." "I'd like to be part of that operation, sir," Ethan said. "I know the players involved and the layout of Redemption Creek." Judge Wilson nodded. "Of course. But first, we need to ensure Miss Montgomery's safety. Once Hargrove learns we have this evidence, she'll be in danger. I've arranged accommodations for her at Mrs. Callahan's boarding house," Ethan explained. It's a secure location and Mrs. Callahan is trustworthy. Good, the judge approved. I'll also assign a deputy to guard the premises until this matter is concluded. He stood, moving toward the door. Wait here while I send for Marshal Jenkins. This will be a long night of planning, I'm afraid. When Judge Wilson had left the room, Elizabeth turned to Ethan, a mixture of relief and anxiety on her face. It's really happening, she said softly. After everything we've been through. Your father's evidence is finally where it needs to be, Ethan finished for her, reaching across to take her hand. You should be proud, Elizabeth. Many would have broken under the pressure you've faced these past days. I had help, she reminded him, squeezing his hand gently. I wouldn't have made it without you. Before Ethan could respond, the door reopened, and Judge Wilson returned with another man tall and wiry, with a neatly trimmed mustache and the unmistakable bearing of a lawman. Marshal Hayes, Miss Montgomery, this is Chief Marshal Jenkins, Judge Wilson introduced them. He'll be coordinating the arrests. Jenkins stepped forward, shaking hands with both of them. Judge Wilson has briefed me on the situation, he said. We'll need to move quickly and quietly. If Hargrove gets wind of this, he could destroy evidence or worse. How soon can we move? Ethan asked. I can have a team ready to ride at first light, Jenkins replied. 10 men, all experienced deputies. With hard riding, we can reach Redemption Creek by tomorrow evening, make the arrests before anyone realizes what's happening. I'm coming with you, Ethan stated firmly. Jenkins nodded. I was counting on it. Your knowledge of the town and the suspects will be valuable. Elizabeth felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach at the thought of Ethan riding back into danger. But she knew better than to protest. This was his duty, and finishing what her father had started was too important to both of them. While the men are making preparations, I'll escort Miss Montgomery to Mrs. Callahan's myself, Judge Wilson offered. She'll be safe there until this is resolved. Plans were quickly finalized. Marshal Jenkins departed to gather his men and prepare for the morning ride, while Judge Wilson arranged for his carriage to take Elizabeth to the boarding house. As the evening grew late, the time came for Elizabeth and Ethan to part, he to the federal building to join the preparations, she to the safety of Mrs. Callahan's establishment. In a moment of privacy before they left Judge Wilson's study, Ethan took both of Elizabeth's hands in his. I'll be back in 3 days, he promised. 4 at the most. Be careful, she urged, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Hargrove and Davis won't surrender easily. I've faced worse odds, Ethan assured her with a gentle smile, and now I have something precious to return to. He reached into his pocket and pressed something into her palm. Keep this for me until I get back. Elizabeth looked down to see a small silver pocket watch, obviously well used and cherished. Ethan, I can't take this. You're not taking it, he corrected her. You're keeping it safe, just as you've kept my heart safe these past days. It was my father's, the only thing I have left of him. When I return, you can give it back to me. The gesture entrusting her with his most valued possession moved Elizabeth deeply. She clutched the watch tightly, then impulsively rose on tiptoe to press a kiss to his cheek. I'll be waiting, she whispered. Their farewell was necessarily brief, with others waiting and urgent matters requiring attention. But as Elizabeth was escorted to Judge Wilson's carriage, she carried with her not just Ethan's watch, but the certainty that what had begun between them on that auction platform was something rare and precious, a partnership forged in adversity and sealed with growing love. Mrs. Callahan's boarding house proved to be a neat, 3-story brick building on a quiet street not far from the federal courthouse. The proprietress herself, a brisk, efficient widow in her 50s, welcomed Elizabeth warmly after Judge Wilson explained the situation in carefully measured terms. "Don't you worry, Miss Montgomery," Mrs. Callahan assured her as she showed Elizabeth to a comfortable room on the second floor. "I run a respectable house, and no one enters without my say-so. You'll be safe here." True to Judge Wilson's word, a deputy marshal was stationed outside the boarding house, with instructions to remain until the operation in Redemption Creek was completed. Elizabeth found herself in a strange limbo, physically safe but emotionally adrift, waiting for news while life in Denver continued around her, oblivious to her private drama. The first day passed slowly, with Elizabeth confined to the boarding house for her safety. Mrs. Callahan proved to be kind beneath her businesslike exterior, providing books and companionship to help pass the time. Elizabeth found herself drawn to the window repeatedly, looking eastward toward the mountains, thinking of Ethan and the others riding toward Redemption Creek and whatever confrontation awaited them there. That night, sleep eluded her despite the comfortable bed. She lay awake, Ethan's watch clutched in her hand, its steady ticking a reminder of the man who had saved her in more ways than one. She thought of her father, wondering if he would approve of the feelings growing between his daughter and his former comrade in arms. Somehow she felt certain he would. The second day brought unexpected activity. Mid-morning, a knock at her door revealed Mrs. Callahan with a visitor, Clara, from the livery stable, bearing a package. "My husband thought you might need these," Clara explained, handing over the bundle. "Some of my daughter's clothes that should fit you better than what you borrowed." Inside the package, Elizabeth found not only several dresses, but also personal items she hadn't even realized she needed: hairpins, a brush, a small bottle of lavender water. The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to her eyes. "Please thank Sam for me," she said warmly. "And you as well. Your kindness to a stranger means more than I can express." Clara waved away her thanks. "Any friend of Ethan Hayes is family to us. He saved Sam's life during the war, just like he saved your father's." This revelation surprised Elizabeth. "He never mentioned that." "He wouldn't," Clara replied with a fond smile. "Ethan's not one to speak of his own good deeds, but Sam would have died at Chickamauga if not for him. When Ethan carried your father to safety after he was shot, Sam was with them, wounded himself." "I had no idea they were so close," Elizabeth said, realizing there was still much she didn't know about Ethan's past. "The war forged bonds that don't break easily," Clara explained. "When Ethan became a marshal, Sam and I were so proud. He's a good man, Miss Montgomery, one of the best." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed softly. "I believe he is." After Clara left, Elizabeth changed into one of the new dresses, a pretty calico in shades of green that complemented her eyes. For the first time since fleeing Redemption Creek, she felt something like her old self again, though she knew she could never truly go back to the person she had been before. Too much had changed, both in her circumstances and within her heart. The third day dawned with a spring storm, rain lashing against the windows of her room. Elizabeth paced anxiously, calculating that Ethan and the federal marshals should have reached Redemption Creek the previous evening. By now, the arrests would have been made or something had gone wrong. The not knowing was almost unbearable. "You'll wear a hole in my carpet, dear," Mrs. Callahan observed when she brought up tea mid-morning. "Try not to worry. Marshal Hayes knows his business." "I can't help it," Elizabeth admitted. "If something happened to him." Mrs. Callahan patted her hand sympathetically. "I've seen that look before on my own face, many years ago when my Harold was away fighting Indians on the frontier. That's love, plain and simple." Elizabeth didn't deny it. Somehow, in the space of less than a week, Ethan Hayes had become essential to her happiness, her future plans now inextricably entwined with his. The possibility of losing him before they'd had a chance to explore what was growing between them was almost too painful to contemplate. Late that afternoon, as the storm finally began to abate, there was a commotion downstairs. Elizabeth hurried to her door, opening it to hear Mrs. Callahan's voice raised in uncharacteristic excitement. "Miss Montgomery, come down quickly." Heart pounding, Elizabeth rushed down the stairs to find the entrance hall occupied by several men in wet coats: Marshal Jenkins, Judge Wilson, and behind them, looking tired but triumphant, Ethan Hayes. "Ethan!" she cried, restraining herself from running straight into his arms only by the greatest effort of will. His face lit up at the sight of her, fatigue momentarily forgotten. "Elizabeth," he greeted her, removing his hat. "We've just come from the courthouse." "The arrests?" she asked anxiously. "Did everything go as planned?" Marshal Jenkins stepped forward. "Better than planned, Miss Montgomery. We took Judge Hargrove completely by surprise at his home outside Redemption Creek. Marshal Davis and 6 others are also in custody. There was some resistance, but no casualties on either side." "Thanks largely to Marshal Hayes here," Judge Wilson added. "His knowledge of the town and the suspects proved invaluable. When Davis tried to rally some local toughs to resist arrest, Hayes managed to outflank them and force their surrender without bloodshed." Elizabeth's eyes found Ethan's across the room, relief and pride washing over her in equal measure. "And my father's name?" she asked. "Has it been cleared?" "Publicly and officially," Judge Wilson assured her. "I've already issued a statement to the territorial papers detailing the corruption that was uncovered and crediting James Montgomery's courage in exposing it. His debts have been declared null and void, as they were the result of criminal activity. And your property will be restored to you," Ethan added. "Judge Wilson has seen to that personally." The news was overwhelming. After days of danger and uncertainty, justice had finally been achieved. Elizabeth felt tears welling in her eyes, tears not of grief this time, but of relief and vindication. "Thank you," she said, looking from one man to another. "All of you. My father would be so grateful." "It's we who are grateful to him," Marshal Jenkins replied solemnly. "His evidence will lead to the prosecution of corrupt officials across 3 territories. He was a hero, Miss Montgomery, plain and simple." After sharing a few more details of the operation, Judge Wilson and Marshal Jenkins took their leave, promising to keep Elizabeth informed of the legal proceedings to come. Mrs. Callahan tactfully withdrew to the kitchen, leaving Ethan and Elizabeth alone in the entrance hall. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the full weight of all they had experienced together hanging in the air between them. Then, with a few quick strides, Ethan crossed the space separating them and pulled Elizabeth into his arms. She went willingly, her arms encircling his neck as he held her close, his face buried in her hair. They stood that way for a long moment, neither speaking, simply absorbing the reality of being together again, safe and whole. "I was so worried," Elizabeth finally whispered against his shoulder. "I promised I'd come back to you," Ethan reminded her, drawing back just enough to look into her eyes. "I always keep my promises." "Yes, you do," she agreed, remembering the words he had spoken in Martha's cabin, his promise that it would take more than a mountain trail to separate him from her now. Elizabeth reached into her pocket and withdrew his silver watch. "I kept it safe, as promised," she said, holding it out to him. Instead of taking it, Ethan closed her fingers around the timepiece. "Keep it a little longer," he said, "until we decide what comes next." "And what does come next, Ethan?" Elizabeth asked, her heart beating faster at the intensity in his gaze. "That depends on you," he replied. "I've been offered a permanent position here in Denver, Chief Deputy Marshal for the territory. It would mean a stable life, a home, a future." "And is that what you want?" Elizabeth asked softly. Ethan's hands came up to frame her face, his touch gentle but certain. "What I want is you, Elizabeth Montgomery, by my side as my partner, my confidante, my wife if you'll have me." The directness of his proposal took her breath away. "Ethan, are you certain? We've known each other less than a week. And in that time, I've learned more about you than I might have discovered in years of conventional courtship," he interrupted. "I know your courage, your intelligence, your loyalty. I know how you look when you're afraid but refusing to show it. I know the sound of your laughter when it's genuine. I know that I love you, Elizabeth, and that I want to build a life with you." The simple declaration of love, the first time either of them had spoken the word aloud, sent a wave of joy through Elizabeth's heart. All the confusion and fear of the past days seemed to fall away, leaving only the certainty that this man, this unexpected gift in the midst of tragedy, was exactly where her future lay. "I love you too," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "And yes, Ethan Hayes, I will marry you not because you rescued me from an auction block or because you helped bring my father's killers to justice, but because in you, I've found someone who sees me as I truly am and values me for it." The smile that broke across Ethan's face was radiant. Without another word, he bent his head and kissed her a kiss that held all the promise of the future they would build together. A future neither of them could have imagined just 1 week ago when fate and injustice had brought them together on an auction platform in Redemption Creek. In the days and weeks that followed, Elizabeth and Ethan's lives settled into a new pattern. They were married in a simple ceremony at Judge Wilson's home with Martha, who had traveled from her cabin for the occasion, Sam and Clara, Mrs. Callahan, and a few of Ethan's colleagues in attendance. Elizabeth wore a dress of ivory silk, a wedding gift from Clara, and carried wildflowers that reminded her of those they had seen on their journey through the mountains. Ethan, resplendent in a new suit, had never looked more handsome as he spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the judge's parlor. When he slipped his mother's ring onto Elizabeth's finger, a simple gold band with a small pearl, it felt like the completion of a circle that had begun with that first moment of eye contact across a crowded auction square. With Ethan's new position came a modest but comfortable home on the outskirts of Denver, close enough to the federal courthouse for convenience, but far enough to provide a sense of peace. Elizabeth found herself embracing the role of a marshal's wife, with the same determination and intelligence she brought to everything. But she was more than just Ethan's wife. With the compensation she eventually received for her father's property, Elizabeth established a small school for girls, emphasizing not just traditional subjects, but also practical skills that would allow them independence in a changing world. Her experiences had taught her the value of self-reliance, and she was determined to pass that lesson on to the next generation. Ethan supported her endeavors wholeheartedly, often visiting the school to teach the older girls basic self-defense or to share stories of justice prevailing against difficult odds. The students adored him almost as much as they respected their headmistress, Mrs. Hayes. Judge Hargrove, Marshal Davis, and their associates faced trial in Denver, with Elizabeth providing key testimony about her father's suspicions and subsequent death. The evidence proved overwhelming, and all were convicted of multiple crimes ranging from fraud to murder. Hargrove received the harshest sentence, life imprisonment, in the territorial penitentiary, where his former position and influence meant nothing. 1 year after their wedding, on a bright spring morning reminiscent of the day they had first met, Elizabeth shared news with Ethan that brought tears of joy to his eyes. They would be welcoming a child by winter. As they stood together in the garden of their home, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach, Elizabeth reflected on the strange, winding path that had led them to this moment of perfect happiness. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, noticing her thoughtful expression, a question he had first asked during their journey through the mountains, when they were still virtual strangers bound by circumstance rather than choice. "About beginnings," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "How the worst day of my life turned out to be the start of everything good that followed." Ethan smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with tender familiarity. "Your father once told me that the true measure of a person isn't how they handle success, but how they face adversity. By that standard, you are truly remarkable, Elizabeth Hayes." "We both are," she corrected him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "And our child will know the story of how his parents found each other, how a bride bound for auction and a cowboy with a badge discovered that they were already meant to be each other's, long before they ever met." As the sun warmed their faces and the promise of new life grew between them, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that while the path had been difficult and painful at times, she wouldn't change a single step that had led her to this moment, this life, this love, this future bright with possibility. For in Ethan Hayes, she had found not just a rescuer or a husband, but a true partner with whom to face whatever challenges and joys lay ahead. Together, they had transformed a false claim made in desperation, "She's already mine," into the deepest truth of their lives.